So what were the triggers of the Great Acceleration, this huge burst in activity after the Second World War? You can read through them, but you see that there's some very important institutional changes that have occurred, dramatic shifts in political and economic structures, which really freed up a lot of movement of finance, of information, of people, and so on. And basically, you could say that there were global networks of communication that crossed the threshold of connectivity after the Second World War. And the human enterprise basically took off, driven not so much by numbers, but by different ways of organizing ourselves and moving capital and information around the planet. And we did it in a stylized way this way. This is a systems approach to what that Great Acceleration is all about. There's the population thing. There's the production consumption. And this is a very strong loop. It's driven by energy, and it's greased or lubricated by institutions, and science, technology, knowledge, and so on is also driving it. But the interesting thing is, this is now the biggest driver here. It's the one that's pushing the whole system very, very fast. Another way of looking at it is look at a global footprint. Look at each of our footprints. How much land and sea do we take to produce the food and fiber we consume and to absorb the waste like carbon dioxide we produce? And if you aggregate this globally, you see something very interesting. In 1961, we used about half of the planet Earth to supply our needs. Somewhere in the 1980s, we crossed the one line, and we now use more than one planet Earth to support the human enterprise. You might say, how can we do that? That's because we're actually eating into the so-called natural capital of the planet. We're not living off the interest, if you want to use that analogy. Now, if you take that one step further and analyze it by country, this is what it looks like. Very interesting graph. On the axis here, vertical axis, is the footprint, environmental impact of people. On the horizontal axis is a thing called the Human Development Index. In other words, this is an index that we want to push to the right because it means people have better lifestyles, better education, health, and so on. These are individual countries. Notice that we missed the sustainable development quadrant here, where we've reached the top level of human development, but we have a sufficiently small ecological footprint in hectares per person. Only one country actually slides into the corner. Everyone else on the development pathway shoots past it. And in trying to increase human welfare, we actually get a footprint that's too large for the planet to bear in the long term. So this is the fundamental dilemma. We don't want countries down here well below the Human Development Index, but we don't want them up there either because the footprint is far too great on the planet. Okay. There we go. So I'll just make a few comments on where we might be going, given this analysis. A lot of people have talked about sustainable development or sustainability. Increasingly, people are talking about collapse. And the question is, where might we be going as we go into the next century? Well, obviously, we can see some things happening. I showed you that graph of the sea ice drop, but I want to show you the latest data that are more interesting. Let's see if it comes up. It's a bit slow. Maybe I need to point it back there. There we go. These are the projections of how fast we would lose that sea ice. This is what the models say. The black line is the data. So the Earth system is actually moving faster than any of the climate models are telling us it's moving. Here's another example, instabilities in the large ice sheets. This is actually taken off the coast of Greenland. They're now moving very fast, and if you look at the perimeter of Greenland, it's losing mass at a high rate. And if you look at the continent as a whole, again, you see this sharp dip occurring in the last 10 years. And that's the amount of ice being lost. If we lose all of that means about 5 or 6 meters of sea level rise globally. So it's a big issue. Oops, let's go back one. So again, the comment that's made by some of the scientists is that the system may be moving faster than the science. We're simply not on top of how fast these ice sheets are moving. Okay, this is a bit slow. Just to show you the resource issue, there's a graph of where the oil is on the planet in red. What's left is in black. So you see that we've just visually, you can see if we're not at peak oil now, we are very soon. But you can also see the distribution is important because it tells you a lot about geopolitical tensions around the planet. Human enterprise is changing. We're moving to a much more globalized world, but increasingly we're moving to a beyond nation-state world where a small but a growing percentage of people are now identifying themselves with multinational corporations and not with countries themselves. So that's another factor that we need to take into account. But basically, we'd say we really have no good handle on where we're going. If you read the headlines you can drag down from the newspapers, you see enormous optimism and enormous pessimism depending where you are, and everything in between. It's an exceptionally chaotic situation. There you see one of the classic ones. Whose world is it? The businessmen think it should be a globalized world, WTO everywhere. People who are worried about the environment say, wait a minute, there's some other values we need to take into account. And you see all sorts of these tensions around the place. So really, as we go into the 21st century, we're in a very volatile world. So I'll just conclude now by looking at where we might be going in terms of the planetary system. If we can get, there we go. Sorry, it's just flicking through a bit fast. That's the famous night lights image. By the way, this does show you again that the population does not correlate with impact on the environment. The impact on the environment in terms of the atmosphere is here, here, and here. The population is here, here, and here. Huge inequities in the human part of the Earth system. And that's something that has to be taken into account whenever you think of solutions to these problems. This is a graph I showed you again. This is the natural pattern of climate variability. Here's the global temperature of the last century. Now, if we look where we might be going in the future, we can use the digitized night lights to see where we're going. Now, again, there's been a lot of worry about China and India being the big bad guys in the future. Now, I'm going to take you through a climate scenario to 2070 visually. Look at China and India, but look at USA, look at Western Europe, and look at how their night lights change. So those are simulated night lights for business as usual 2070. You can calculate the emissions based on that energy scenario, and you can calculate what the climate might do based on that. And that's the next graph. There is natural climate variability. These are the projections of the IPCC for the next century. And this is why so many climate scientists are getting increasingly worried, is that this is a very, very big and rapid excursion. In fact, if we go to the upper end scenarios, this is the same change in magnitude as between an ice age and a warm period, except it's sitting on top of a warm period and it's getting even warmer. And where are we tracking? This is some very interesting work by the Global Carbon Project, which shows that our observed emissions, and you see this area here, blown up here, are on the highest trajectory. This is the so-called business as usual. That any of the stabilization scenarios that governments and others are talking about, we've already gone past where we ought to be to get on them. So it's not a matter for 2015 or 2020 or for our kids or our grandkids. We're already, with a fair bit of momentum, well above a trajectory which would get us down to stabilizing around 2 or 2.5 degree temperature change. So I'll conclude by saying a couple of things. How important is population as a driver of global change? Not just climate change, but these other things. I would say achieving sustainability at a global scale would be much easier with a population that's much less, of say 1 billion or less. There's no doubt that it would help us a lot if we had fewer people on the planet. However, I want to say clearly that there are much bigger drivers of environmental change now that are operating, and they are affluence and technology, often combined as consumption. In fact, the biggest threat to the planetary environment and the biggest constraint to achieving sustainability is really the affluence technology complex that really drives contemporary Western culture and in fact is spreading nearly everywhere around the planet as a model for how humans ought to live. My final comment, sustainability or collapse. I think it's not so much going to be decided by technology, because what technologies we decide to deploy depend on much deeper factors, and these are values, aspirations, preferences, and choices. So it's really down to the human dimensions of where we see our place as a species on the planet. That's what's going to determine whether we really do achieve this big turnaround and achieve sustainability, or whether we're headed for collapse. So I'll stop there, Melinda, and hopefully have enough time for some discussion.
Okay, thanks very much, Will. A fascinating presentation, and the human enterprise looks to be a fairly dangerous sort of creature we've invented. We can take 10 minutes now for questions. So if people would like to nominate questions, we've got a microphone at the back.